Dilmun, the Sumerian paradise, rises again from the sands of eternal oblivion.
We use technology to rebuild what humanity let die.
Eden is drying up, leaving behind only echoes of a lost glory.
History repeats itself. The end is merely a new beginning.
There is a place that almost every human being on Earth has imagined at least once, even though no one has ever seen it. It does not belong to a single people or a single faith. It appears in the Torah, in the Bible, and in the Quran. It has been painted by Renaissance artists, described by medieval poets, and sought by explorers for centuries across the plains of Mesopotamia. It is the Garden of Eden, the first home of humanity according to the scriptures, the paradise where everything began and where everything was lost. In this video, I use modern artificial intelligence tools to reconstruct for the first time this place as the sacred texts describe it, shifting perspectives, moving through its landscapes, and entering scenes no artist of the past could have imagined. The goal is not only to look back into the past, but to step into it, to walk through that garden that lives in the collective memory of billions of people and ask what it meant then and what it still means today. And in the end, we will look at the lands where many believe this garden may have existed, to see what time has left in its place. Before walking through the garden, it is worth pausing for a moment at the origin of the account. The book of Genesis, in its second chapter, tells that God planted a garden in the east, in a region called Eden, and there he placed the man he had formed from the dust of the ground. The word Eden probably comes from the Akkadian Edinu, meaning plain or steppe, though in Hebrew it is associated with pleasure or delight. It was not simply an orchard. It was a place designed as a dwelling, as a space of direct communion between the divine and the human, something no other land on the planet could offer. From the soil of that garden, according to Genesis, God made every kind of tree grow that was pleasing to the eye and good for food. This was not ordinary vegetation. Every tree had a function, every fruit a purpose. And at the center of everything stood two trees that would define humanity's destiny forever. The first was the tree of life, planted in the very heart of the garden, a symbol of the eternal life God offered his creatures. Ancient traditions imagined it as a date palm in Mesopotamia or as a fig tree in Egypt, always associated with abundance and the divine presence. The second was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the only one whose fruit was forbidden, the boundary separating obedience from freedom, trust from doubt. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided into 4 branches that extended to the edges of the known world. The first was called Pishon, and it flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there was fine gold, bdellium, and onyx stone. The second was the Gihon, which flowed around the land of Cush. The third was the Hiddekel, known today as the Tigris, which runs east of Assyria. And the fourth was the Euphrates, the most frequently mentioned river in the Bible, the great river that for millennia served as a border, a source of life, and a geographic reference for entire civilizations. The mention of these 4 rivers has fascinated scholars for centuries because 2 of them, the Tigris and the Euphrates, still exist today and run through the lands of modern Iraq, rising in the mountains of what is now Turkey. The other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, have never been identified with certainty. Some researchers have linked the Pishon to an ancient dry riverbed detected by satellite in Arabia, known as Wadi al-Batin. Others associate the Gihon with rivers that once flowed toward the Persian Gulf. What all these waterways suggest is a landscape of absolute fertility, a place where water was not scarce but abundant, generous, inexhaustible. When we think of Eden as the scriptures describe it, what appears before us is neither desert nor jungle, but something in between, a garden ordered by a higher intelligence where every element fulfilled a precise role. The animals lived in harmony, without predation, without fear. Adam was placed there with a specific task, to work the land and care for it. It was not eternal leisure, but meaningful labor. God brought before him all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the sky for him to name them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. To name was to know was to govern with gentleness. But there was a condition. Of every tree in the garden they could eat freely, except from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If they ate from it, they would die. This was the only boundary in a paradise without walls, the only test in a world without conflict. We do not know exactly what kind of fruit it was. Western Christian tradition depicted it as an apple, perhaps because of a word play in Latin where malum means both apple and evil. The Quran does not specify the fruit and simply calls it the tree, or sometimes the tree of immortality. In Islamic tradition, some scholars suggest it may have been wheat or barley. What mattered was not the nature of the fruit, but the act of taking it, the decision to cross the limit God had established. Then the serpent appears, the most cunning of all the creatures of the field that the Lord God had made. In Genesis, it is not identified as the devil, simply as an animal that speaks. In the Quran, it is called Iblis, the shaitan, who approached Adam and his wife, promising that if they ate from the tree, they would become like angels or attain immortality. The temptation was subtle. It did not offer brute power or material wealth. It offered knowledge, the possibility of seeing the world as God saw it, of distinguishing good from evil on their own without divine instruction. Eve took of the fruit and ate, and afterward she gave some to Adam, and he also ate. At that moment, according to Genesis, the eyes of both were opened, and they realized they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. What followed was the most solemn moment of the account. They heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid among the trees. God called to Adam and asked where he was. Adam answered that he was afraid because he was naked, and God asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" The dialogue that follows is one of the oldest and most human ever written. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. No one takes full responsibility. It is perhaps the first literary portrait of how human nature behaves when confronted with its own consequences. The sentence was threefold. The serpent was cursed above all animals, condemned to crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. The woman's pains in childbirth would be multiplied, and she would live in tension of desire toward the man. And to the man it was said that the ground would be cursed because of him, that by the sweat of his brow he would eat bread until he returned to the ground from which he was taken. For dust he was, and to dust he would return. It is striking how in Islamic tradition this moment is interpreted differently. The Quran says that Adam and his wife recognized their error, asked God for forgiveness, and were forgiven. Their descent to the earth was not a final punishment, but part of a greater divine plan, a necessary test for humanity to learn to seek the path back. Then God did something that often goes unnoticed in quick readings of the text. He made garments of skins for them and clothed them. Before sending them out, he covered them. Before closing the door, he prepared them for the cold that would come outside. And then he drove them out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which they had been taken. To the east of the garden, he placed cherubim and a flaming sword that turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. That image, celestial beings armed with fire guarding the entrance to a paradise closed forever, has echoed in art, literature, and faith for more than 3,000 years. Before this account was written in Hebrew, long before Jewish, Christian, or Islamic traditions existed, the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia were already telling stories of divine gardens. In the myth of Enki and Nin-Hursag, dated around the 3rd millennium before our era, a place called Dilmun is described. A pure, clean and radiant land where there was no disease, no death, no old age. The god Enki filled Dilmun with fresh water, transforming it into a green and fertile garden, and the mother goddess Nin-Hursag caused 8 sacred plants to sprout. Enki ate those plants without permission, which angered the goddess, who imposed a curse upon him. The parallels are difficult to ignore. A divine garden, forbidden fruits, a transgression, and its consequences. Some researchers have linked Dilmun to the present-day island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, a place that in antiquity was known for its fresh water springs rising in the midst of the salty sea. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest literary text we possess, the hero travels to a garden of the gods where trees bear fruits of precious stones, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and agate. There he seeks the plant of immortality, finds it at the bottom of the sea, but a serpent steals it while he sleeps. Again, paradise, the serpent, lost immortality. These coincidences do not necessarily mean one story was copied from another, but they do show us that the idea of a perfect place at the beginning of time, a garden where humanity lived in harmony before losing everything, does not belong to a single culture. It is an image humanity has carried since its earliest attempts to understand the world. Now I want to bring you to the present and show how the lands where many believe this garden may have existed look today. The region where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, in southern modern Iraq, near the city of Al-Qurna, has for centuries been pointed to as a possible site of biblical Eden. Even today, there is a small monument there with a dry tree that locals call the Tree of Adam. But the landscape surrounding that place could not be farther from any image of paradise. Both rivers have lost up to 60% of their flow since the 1960s due to dam construction in Turkey and Iran, climate change, and decades of conflict. The Mesopotamian marshes, once the largest wetlands in Western Asia and home to the marsh Arabs for millennia, were almost completely drained in the 1990s, and although they began to recover, recent droughts have pushed them again to the brink of disappearance. Iraq has recorded its driest year since 1933. Salt water from the Persian Gulf is advancing upstream through the Shatt al-Arab, the confluence of both rivers, destroying farmland and forcing entire families to abandon their homes. A 65-year-old farmer in Ras al-Bisha, where the Shatt al-Arab empties into the Gulf, recently pointed to the dried palm trees around him and said they needed water, that there was no more fresh water, that there was no more life. It is hard not to see the irony. The very lands where tradition places the original paradise, the place where, according to the scriptures, rivers flowed with infinite generosity and trees bore fruit without effort, are now among the regions of the planet most vulnerable to climate change. What was once the cradle of civilization now faces the possibility of becoming uninhabitable, not because an angel with a flaming sword guards it, but because we ourselves, through our choices, have altered the balance of the waters that sustained life for millennia. If I could visit that place with what I know today, I think I would look at those dry plains and reflect on how many times humanity has lost a paradise, not because of a divine curse, but because of its own inability to care for what it was given. The Garden of Eden, whatever its nature, literal or symbolic, remains perhaps the most powerful image we have created as a species. A reminder that there was, or could have been, a moment when everything was in its place, when water ran clear, trees bore fruit, and humanity lived without fear. And that moment was lost, not for lack of beauty or abundance, but because of a single decision. I truly thank you for watching this video. Your ideas, opinions, and constructive comments are what shape what comes next. If you have any suggestions or would like to propose cities or places for future episodes, leave them in the comments. Until next time.